So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and panelists, dear partners and colleagues, those of you here in the room and joining online, it's great to be part of the 2022 Balkans and Black Sea Forum in this beautiful city of Athens. And thank you very much for the hosts for organizing it. I believe the sessions so far have focused a lot on the political and economic aspects of crises. But I was looking at what this forum is supposed to be about. So we are reviewing challenges, we're assessing implications, we're identifying opportunities and potential innovations. And I think we should, at this point, agree that crises actually have a human face. I think definitely when we think in terms of the impact of crisis, we see a human face. And I would also contend that it's true if we think in terms of prevention of crises or disasters from happening in the first place. And I hope that this resonates with you in some way, because I think we all feel in one way or another the compounded effects of multiple crises. I think we're still feeling the impacts of COVID-19. I think in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of conversations, and as we've heard from the previous speaker, it's at the top of the agenda in terms of the impacts of climate change, and of course, we're experiencing the impacts of an ongoing war in the region. But when we speak about impact, the bottom line is actually that crises are experienced differently on the basis of existing inequalities, including gender inequality, which is the most pervasive and perhaps what is truly global form of inequality. And I'm not going to throw too much data at you, but I think some of the data is very relevant. If we look at economic inequalities, the picture is very disturbing. By the end of this year, many women will have insufficient income to meet even basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, or energy. We know that across the world, there's approximately 383 million women and girls who will be living by the end of this year in extreme poverty. And women are more likely to be living in poverty than men because they have less access to basic rights, like the right to free movement, ownership of land, or control over resources. And they face systematic discrimination and violence that becomes worse in periods of crisis or instability. So pre-existing gender inequalities and gender-based discrimination constitute drivers of vulnerability. So this is going to be very important to keep in mind as we talk through these 2 days. But it's also a vicious cycle, because actually the crises themselves are going to make those inequalities even deeper. According to a recent study that was undertaken by UN Women together with DESA, it is now estimated that to close all gender gaps across the world, it will take us 300 years. So we're further behind than we were before, and we're nowhere near being on course to achieve the 2030 targets. So we weren't doing very well to begin with, but I think this is a moment for us to recognize we're doing even worse because of the multiple and intersecting crises. So not only that, we really need to look at this from even the efficiency perspective, because women's unequal economic participation is going to hold us back in terms of resilience to any further economic shocks and having any chance at economic recovery. If we look at the region more broadly, the Europe and Central Asia region, only 45% of working age women are actually actively engaged in the labor market. And we know that of those 45%, actually millions have left the labor force for good because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also know many women are concentrated in the informal labor force. So even aside from agriculture, about a third of women are self-employed in informal work. And this tends to be home-based, small scale, it's unprotected and uncounted. And on top of that, and I think a lot of you have heard this in the last couple of years, unpaid care and domestic work is on the rise for women and girls. We know that in this region, women do 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work than men do. So the question is, what do we do about it? And I will tell you that for the long haul, for making sure that we have solid foundations, so to make sure that we're going in the same direction and don't regress, we really have to tackle those structural barriers to achieving gender equality. And this is why, at UN Women, we put a lot of emphasis on gender-responsive governance. And we have many years, decades-long work with governments in the region, particularly strong in the Western Balkans, that looks at gender-responsive planning, policy-making, monitoring, and very importantly, budgeting. That focuses on making sure that we're not just putting words on paper and making commitments, but we're actually investing in the right areas, and that we're also doing the monitoring and reporting to make sure there's accountability. So national budgets are key to making the change that we want to see happen actually happen. But we also have to look at financing. And we heard about the EU and the EU integration process from the previous speaker. As UN Women, we developed an initiative, a program that is called the Gender Equality Facility, which is actually looking at the investments that the EU is making through the instrument of pre-accession in candidate and potential candidate countries to make sure that those investments are also aligned with the EU acquis. One of the impacts that we've seen from the Ukraine crisis, for example, is the 2023 IPA funds, the Instrument for Pre-Accession Funds, have been redirected for energy subsidies. And this has now stalled a lot of the really important work that we've been doing in other areas for the longer term development. But I would say that energy poverty is also a gendered issue, so there's also a potential. And I really call on governments to really look at the ways in which they are looking at their budgets, but also the financing that is coming in, including on integration. I won't go into a lot of detail, but when we look at structural barriers, it is really important to also look at harmful social norms that keep setting us back, and civil society organizations being such a critical partner to address this issue. And I do want to say that gender equality is a political issue. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I think many of you will understand what I say when I say that there's a pushback on women's rights. And this isn't happening in just any single country. It's happening along many countries, and it's very much linked with nationalist discourse. And that's where regional cooperation is really needed to tackle this pushback and keep us going in the right direction. So I'm going to keep repeating it. We need to tackle these structural barriers. We have to make whatever we're not seeing, whatever is invisible, visible so we can tackle it. And we have to look at investments in a different way, not only to reap economic or political benefits, but also long-term social benefits. And so we have to approach challenges in a different way. But there are, for the purposes of our discussion today, also other areas that can accelerate transformation. It's not at the expense of the structural, but in addition to it. And if we look at the areas of transformation, I think it's been covered also adequately by previous speakers, but we do look at science and technology are the fastest growing industries worldwide. And we know that 90% of jobs worldwide have some digital component or require digital skills. And there's a high demand for professionals in the STEM fields and for ICT skills. But there's a shortage of workers. So we need to look at things in a different way. And what does this have to do with gender equality? Well, we know that there are gender gaps in this field. And the European Institute for Gender Equality has put out data and evidence to show that actually narrowing the gender gap in STEM education in the EU alone could generate up to 1.2 million more jobs and can increase long-term GDP by up to 820 billion euros by 2050. So that's a good case for making this investment. So we have to really now think and make a compact through this forum that as we are navigating these global crises and the crises in our region, we have to make sure that they are not making existing inequalities worse and that we don't stop the good work that has been started to tackle those inequalities. So we have to reshape the status quo because whatever we've been doing got us to where we are today. Is not going to get us to where we want to go. So we really have to rethink. And economic resilience, recovery, and growth are contingent on smart economics that recognize and value women's contributions. I invite all of the participants to engage in the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women, which is looking at innovation and technological change and education in the digital age for achieving gender equality and empowerment for all women and girls. These intergovernmental fora, especially at the global level, should be connected to this kind of regional dialogue, so we keep moving in the right direction. And I want to also speak about, this is a higher level kind of message, but it is possible to also leverage, for example, information and communication technology in the response to crises. And I wanted to talk about an event that's actually happening simultaneously with this one in Ukraine, that is looking at women leaders in the digital space. And we are implementing this together with partners, including the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine and Google Ukraine. And it's they were doing this online marathon, and it's part of a program that is actually increasing access of women and girls to the digital space. But through this initiative, when the war hit, we developed a digital platform that is called DIA, and it's under the slogan of "I know I will survive," has been able to help over 300,000 women access information. So the digital space was leveraged to support women under dire conditions so that they can access services, they know where they can get them, and they can report their status if they have had destruction or loss of property, if they've become displaced, or they have experienced some form of violence. This speaks to the spirit of partnership, but it also really speaks to the commitment by the government of Ukraine and its private sector partners to continue on the road of gender equality and looking for ways in which to keep pushing forward, even under the hardest of circumstances. And so I really commend them on that, and I think we all should commend them on that. Another key accelerator, and I can see from the time I'm not going to be able to talk about it a lot, but really what I want to focus on, there are areas where we're not looking for additional investments, but we're looking at the investments that we're making in a different way. One area of this work is what we are calling gender responsive procurement. Actually, if we look, and it's focused very much on women entrepreneurs. Around the world, we have almost 225 million women entrepreneurs, and they own around 35% of all the firms in the formal economy. But when we look at the global spend on procurement, they get only 1% of what private or public sector are spending in their procurement practices. There's something very off here. And this is what we're trying to correct as UN Women by convening partners around the table to do this, because this is a lost opportunity. I would be happy to answer more on this. We covered it in the Agribusiness Forum last year. We are calling it gender responsive procurement. We're starting in-house. We're leveraging our mandate. We have a triple mandate on the normative. We do coordination work within the UN system, and we have our programmatic work. We're practicing what we preach. We ourselves are implementing gender responsive procurement. We're leading the UN system to do more. We're building the business case, particularly with private sector, to do this. We're going with a certification program so that we know which businesses are actually women-owned, which ones are women-run, or which ones have gender equality or gender-responsive practices. And we're doing training programs from the buyer side, the seller side, and very importantly also on the investor side, because we need those businesses to grow. And we place very much women entrepreneurs at the center of what we do. They are experts on what they need. They are doing the work. We're just not investing in them. We're not buying from them. So there's something that everybody in this forum can do in this area of work. And it really is about partnership. I invite you to find out more, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, whether they come up during the panel or on the sidelines. But many thanks again, and I hope that I've planted some seeds that will get you to think about what could be done differently through this forum and through your practices, wherever you're coming from. Thank you so much.
Thank you.